Thank you, Antoine, for joining us. Welcome everybody to the third day of the Primavera Fest 2020, Materialness, Material Architecture. As you already know, this is a 4-day symposium that started last week with lectures from Federico Garrido and Matías del Campo. This series of events focus on the problem of materiality in architecture, or better, the problem of material architecture. In recent years, the practice of architecture has been exploring new fields regarding its relation with the materiality of the world, mainly regarding the digital. More and more, a digital approach to architecture is closing the gap between the actual and the virtual, and this approach is bringing up new problems regarding the way we relate to the discipline as an intellectual enterprise and its materiality. What are the symbolic constructions that architecture engages? How the materiality of architecture can orient human behavior and construct messages that transcend the virtual. Today, we have the great pleasure to hear to Antoine Picon. Antoine Picon is the She-Ware Travel-Steed Professor of the History of Architecture and Technology at the Harvard GSD. Trained as an engineer, architect, and historian, Antoine works on the history of architectural and urban technologies from the 18th century to the present. He has published extensively, and his most recent books offer a comprehensive overview of the changes brought by the computer and digital culture to the theory and practice of architecture, as well to the planning and experience of the city. I personally recommend Digital Culture in Architecture, an Introduction for the Design Profession from 2010, and Ornament, the Politics of Architecture and Subjectivity, 2013. The second one, on ornament, is one brilliant example of Antoine's interest in understanding the discipline as a multiple manifold of integrated problematics, where ornament, far from being understood as a complementary issue, is central to the problem of structure and organization. I'm honored to introduce you to Antoine Picon. Thank you, Antoine, for being here.
Thank you very much. You can hear me?
Perfectly, yeah.
The sound is good. Okay, so let me share my screen as the usual thing. So share screen. It's always a bit weird not to see the participant, but we'll do with it. Okay, so first of all, I'm really sorry, but my Spanish is, worse than what you might imagine. So what I'm going to present today is actually a development from a book I published in French a couple of years ago, La Materialité de l'Architecture, and which an extended version of which is going to appear in the US at the beginning of next year. It's a book that revolves around the notion of materiality as suggested by the title, but as you will see, I have a somewhat peculiar definition of materiality. And here I will be discussing the relation between materiality and politics, which for me is one of the problems today. So it will not be about the digital or that kind of thing. It's really about, in what sense can architecture be political if we take into account its materiality. So let me begin by, the general question of architecture and politics. In the past years, the relation between architecture and politics has made a spectacular comeback. This is inseparable from a shift in the nature of the debate about architecture. The days when globalization and, the rising star system were monopolizing the attention are definitely over. I think now we're back to a question such as how can architecture contribute to a different future, a more just one, a more environmentally friendly, which is, of course, a very fundamental interrogation. That explains why Marxist approaches have come back. But these approaches tend very often to consider architecture as a consequence of more fundamental forces. So my question here is really, is architecture in itself as a discipline capable of some kind of political agency? So this is not a question that is evidently easy to answer. So traditionally, when dealing with such a question, the political agency of architecture, there were two kinds of answer, two major lines. One had to do with the general layout or program. Architecture was supposed to be political insofar that it serves specific purposes. And the Forbidden City or the Castle of Versailles were definitely political in that respect, just like Bentham panopticon. Another had to do with political ideology and the way architecture could serve it through its strong symbolic dimension. From that perspective, the pyramids were political, just like the churches of the Counter-Reformation with their abundant decor. Note, by the way, that the symbolic was generally understood as a direct translation of the core values of the political regime it served. So these approaches have their interest, and I don't want to discard them, but they have also their shortcomings. And these shortcomings are an illustration of a broader issue on how to interpret built object. First, if we take the general organization of an architectural building, it may prove more flexible than it may appear. There is, for example, a genealogy leading from Versailles to the 19th century Fourierist phalanstery. Versailles is a royal castle. The phalanstery is supposed to be an utopian development, collective housing of for an utopia. So this is definitely not the same politics, but the organization of the buildings are strikingly similar. In the 1930s, if we now look to the symbolic, the return to order that marked the entire swath of architecture, the return to a kind of neoclassic monumentality, characterized extremely different regime from Nazi Berlin to democratic Washington. This is, for example, the Truman Building of 1937. It could almost resemble a building by Albert Speer. So above all, these traditional approach leave aside a series of other dimensions of the relation between architecture and politics. And these relations may be defined in a much broader way than through the participation of architecture to the rituals of a political regime or its capacity to express the core values of its regime. So historians in the past years have tried to go beyond that by, for example, looking at architectural institutions, architectural techniques, etc. But this is not what I'd like to follow here. What I am interested in is actually to return to two dimensions that play a fundamental role in the definition of architecture is about, two dimensions which are inseparable from architecture's materiality. The first are the sensations that stem from the direct encounter with buildings, the experience of surface and volume, of space, texture, light, and color exert an influence on us that often present political resonance beyond the individual character of the sensation thus aroused. For example, if you take the feelings conveyed by elementary sequences such as door, staircase, or windows, or the impression produced by changes in level of illumination or by effects of opacity and transparency, they do have a certain relation to politics. I'll return, for example, to Le Corbusier a couple of times in this lecture. And when Le Corbusier complicates the relation between the outside and the inside, this is typical of these kind of sensation that architecture produces. Schinkel, more evidently in the Altes Museum, when he has this extraordinary sequence in which you start to reach the museum, you start in the dark from the lower flight of steps, and then you ascend to then discover the city, is another example. So I'll be interested in this kind of thing. I am also going to be interested in ornament, and at least for two reasons. The first is the importance it used to have in architecture. And the second is, and of course, an importance linked to its deeply material character. Look at this, modest ornament. It's as if matter was animated. I'll come back to that in a moment. The second is because, of course, ornament has returned recently in the digital age. So the two dimension I've mentioned, sensation, the sequence of space and the sensation they arise, and ornament and symbolism, it's not a completely new thing. Phenomenologists used to be, for example, interested in that, but I am interested in that for probably other reasons. One of them being, by the way, the relation to language. Actually, it's as if these two things had to do with the animation of matter. Architecture in some ways is something that tries to animate matter. This is an engraving showing the Greek mythological figure Amphion, playing music, and the blocks of a wall spontaneously put themselves in place. Architecture is actually an animation of matter, perhaps a little less dramatic, but through composition, through the general composition, but also through ornament. And this is something that has endured from the Baroque to today. So why am I interested with that? Because the animation of matter presupposes that there is something common between matter and ourselves, as if buildings were acquiring something like a visage to address us. And it's, by the way, telling that one of the oldest ways to convey the effect on moldings on a facade is to compare them to the creases of a face. So, which will lead me now to what do I call materiality, which may be slightly different from what is usually understood. So the materiality of architecture, and then I'll try to explain how I play with that to try to explain how architecture can be political in a way closer to what the discipline means. So the first thing is, speaking of materiality, materiality is actually something that is about the relation we have with matter. When we say that something is imbued with materiality, it means that we relate to it in a pretty tangible way. So materials play, of course, a role. Here, when you see the pilotis of Le Corbusier, Unité d'habitation of Marseille, one cannot but be struck by the presence of the material, of the concrete. But now, when we say something is material, it means that it is almost tangible for us. So my argument here is that actually what we call material has, what we consider as material has varied from one period to another. For example, had you been born in the Middle Ages, to see angels, to see miracles would have not been surprising and would have been part of the material world that's around us. In the 19th century, for example, a lot of people believed that ghosts were actually partly material and that you could even photograph it. This is a guy who specialized in photographing ghosts in the 19th century. So in some ways, it is as if ghosts were more material than today. So let me now introduce perhaps the central point, which is the idea that materiality is about the relation we have with matter, but it's about also the way we understand ourselves. To make that idea clear, this is of course by Descartes, let me refer myself to an 18th century philosopher called Condillac, who wrote an interesting treatise on sensation. And in this treatise, he imagines at first a statue who has no sense of no vision, no hearing, no touch, etc. And Condillac imagines, this is a philosophical fiction, that he gives the statue successively vision, hearing, touch, etc., etc. So you might wonder, what is the most important moment in the story? And actually, the most important moment for Condillac is not vision, and you could think it would be vision. Neither is it hearing. It's actually touch. Why touch? Because the statue, once she receives touch, begins to feel that there are obstacles around them. She begins to feel the texture of materials, etc. And because of that contact with the world. The statue realizes that actually she is a sentient being and there is a world outside, and she is actually partly defined through the experience of this outside world. So where do I want to go? The following idea that architecture, it's not about materials, it's about materiality. That is, it's about our relation to what is out there, to materials, to light, to shadow, etc. And it's a relation that is partly about us, about who we are. So that actually one could say that architecture is a co-construction of the exterior world as a material world and ourself as a subject that experience this material world. A simpler way, or at least simpler in appearance, would be to say that actually architecture is about inhabiting. What does it mean to inhabit? It means that through the contact with a series of material elements, walls, windows, ceiling, through the contact with light by architecture, etc., we feel at home, which means that actually we define partly ourselves through that. So the history of architecture could be actually a history of the successive way we've understood the exterior world, the physical world, and also by the same token, we've understood ourselves. If you take the Renaissance, it's well known that the Renaissance is about a world a material world that is measurable, that can be represented in perspective because it is measurable. And this is also a world which is ordered by a new type of subject, the Renaissance ideal human, that is able to order and make sense of that world. To give another example, the way materiality is constructed by architecture, but not only by architecture, the automobile, for example, has played a role in our contemporary understanding of, who we are. In some ways, we perceive the world in relation to the sensation of in a mechanized society, and our body is also part. The way we understand it is also part of that. So where do I want to go? That probably we are today in the middle of a major mutation, transformation of materiality, which means that the physical world, our understanding of it is changing. In architectural terms, for example, we're more and more sensitive to questions that we used to consider as secondary in architecture. For example, gradients of temperature, of humidity, things like architect Philip Ram, for example, is working on in his project. We used also to think that information was abstract. Today, we live in a world in which gradients of temperature, but also information, etc., are part of our new material world. So what does it mean for architecture? What does it mean to inhabit architecture may be the most central question of digital architecture today. Now, I'm going to follow the two tracks that I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture. First one will be on the question of sensation and how we go from sensation to situation. The second one will be about ornament, symbolic, and decor. So and then I'll wrap up and try to discuss how those two tracks may enable us to understand better in what sense could architecture as an autonomous discipline be political. So the fundamental effectiveness of architecture lies in its capacity to organize matter in ways that provoke sensation and generate affects that can be shared. And a large part of these sensation and affect are created by means specific to the discipline, such as the definition of an outside and inside, the play on scale and dimension, the contrast between light and shadow, opacity and transparency, to name only a few. Architecture can also contribute to focus attention on specific areas. Think of the pivotal role of the stage in theater. So architecture in some ways built situation, very often in close collection with some key qualities of the materials it uses, from brick to concrete and from wood to steel. And the quality of the materials very often constitute an integral part of architectural effect. Think, for example, of the way Louis Kahn, defines the library from, the opposition between light and shadow, the opposition between the stacks that you don't see here and the carrel, these places where you can enjoy the exterior light while reading. So actually the whole library experience is for him very much linked to a very concrete experience of a number of sensations. So all that to say that architectural sensation and effect, which by the way are seldom univocal, I'll return to that, they are part of what architecture can achieve. Very often, by the way, very often also they constitute rhythm. They actually build a kind of itinerary. Take, for example, Le Corbusier at the Villa Savoie, where actually the whole building is about a series of physical experience. I mentioned the mechanical experience. You arrive at the villa by car, then you park at the down, and then you go by foot on the ramp until you arrive at the top where you are in contact with the elements. The whole building, it's as if the whole building was as a function to enable you to pass from the mechanical speed to the experience of the light, of the sun, of the surrounding landscape, as if in some way it was, and this is of course an example, a prototypical example of what Le Corbusier called the promenade, but this is actually what I call actually the construction of a situation, which has a series of sensations. And of course, with the idea, where is the politics? With the idea that, these sensations are conducive to certain emotion and certain attitudes and behaviors. For example, for Schinkel, the itinerary leading from the staircase to the top of the museum is something that must prepare you to the experience of culture. To take another example, this is actually a building by one of my colleagues at Harvard, Rahul Mehrotra, which has a so-called intelligent facade, but the facade, it's not because it's electronic, it's because there is a vertical garden tended by people. And what is interesting here is that actually architecture is political, because actually the people on one side and the other of the glass are actually from very different status in society. The people who tend the garden of a very modest origin, those inside are actually yuppie working in the informations, in the computer industry. And usually in India, these people don't see each other. They literally don't see each other. Here, architecture is not equalizing their condition, but actually architecture forces them to recognize that the other exists. So architecture, in a way, constructs situations, and these situations have a political potential. To give another example, a friend of mine, Ginny Gang, has built a tower which was quite successful in Chicago, the Aqua Tower, which is based on the assumption that usually towers, high-rise, separate people. And here, the game with a balcony is about making people visible if they want one to another. So architecture uses situation and affect as a way to construct political opportunities of people to recognize that they exist, that each other exists, possibly to connect, no more than a suggestion, but a suggestion is already a lot. So in some ways, architecture is political as a matrix of possible social situation from built situation. Now, I'll pass on that. Let me move to ornament and decor, which is the other aspect I wanted to discuss. And, this is based on the book that I wrote a few years ago about ornament. Traditional ornament, we tend to forget that today they were not only about beauty, etc. They were political insofar that they carried a symbolic content. For example, if you saw something like that on the door of an Italian house of the 17th century, you knew at least two things. You knew that it was a noble family, and you knew because of the hat on the top of the emblem that actually this family had given a cardinal to the church. So in some ways, the symbolic content of ornament had very often to do with social hierarchy. Now, because of postmodernism, we have become very often very critical of the idea that ornament should be symbolic. And because, of course, we've got very distrustful of too much symbolism. And it's true, it's not only because only of postmodernism, but because 19th century ornaments were heavily ornamental. This relatively problematic composition, which is actually by a great sculptor, Carpeaux, is actually symbolizing the French Empire protecting agriculture and the sciences. It's quite heavy. It's actually ornamenting one of the pavilions of the Tuileries in Paris. But of course, it is not something that we find very inspiring today. Another thing probably is that we have forgotten that ornament was not something static. The symbolism of architecture was seldom a static set of things. It's not as if, ornament had a meaning like words have meaning in a dictionary. To give you an example, the Ionic column was supposed to evoke the female body, but it did not resemble a female body. It was as if the column was becoming like a female body. So symbolism was an unfolding, a development, which explains why the caryatid, for example, is an extreme case that was never meant to be replicated ad infinitum, because the caryatid, the column had been transformed into a static symbol of a woman, which was far less interesting than the becoming like the body of a woman. So, which was typically the postmodern mistake, which is to believe that ornament and symbolism are completely fixed. Actually, ornament was never functioned like words in a vocabulary. So it's a process of building signification. So all that to say that the meaning of ornament was not static, and in addition, ornament functioned together. That's to say, an ornament usually worked with another ornament, with a third ornament, etc., so that they created what I call a decor. The decor as something immersive, something that orients, something that suggests there is a meaning, but without necessarily a completely fixed meaning. To give an example, the Gothic is typical of this kind of decor. Contrary to what Victor Hugo famously said, cathedrals were never like books, because most of the people actually in the Middle Ages were not able necessarily to understand all the pictures, all the statues and their meaning, etc. But what they grasped was that overall, these had a religious meaning. And this is the overall, that they had the impression that actually, because they were immersed in that decor, that actually their world was meaningful. So all that to say that one of the powerful things that architecture does is actually to suggest that human action, human presence has a meaning, which is a much more powerful thing than to just say what you should do. Architecture very seldom tells humans what they should do. Architecture suggests that humans are welcome, that they have a place, that what they do matters. To go back to the theater, architecture is like a stage. As soon as you ascend the stage, whatever you say is different than if you are just in the room. So architecture actually frames human action. And this is what decor did. The same is true in Versailles, for example. Versailles Of course, Versailles is completely symbolic. This is the Salon of Peace, and there is the Salon of War, and in between the Hall of Mirrors, etc. But it's the overall decor, which is the most powerful thing. So, and this is to illustrate this idea of stage. Probably the other very deeply political things that architecture does is actually to suggest again that there is a stage on which human action have a sense. Somebody who was, an architect was very aware of that is, for example, Charles Garnier. A lot of people mock the fact that actually the entrance of the opera is as large as the theater proper. But because Garnier understood one thing, in the 19th century, people went to the opera not necessarily to listen to music, but as a social ritual. And, society looking at itself was as important as, whatever opera was played. So the opera is a decor before being an opera. And this is what Garnier understood. So I have been shorter than what I imagined, but where do I want to go with all that? As I said at the beginning, if you imagine 1 second that materiality is not something absolute, you cannot say that something is, when you say that something seems more material than another, it means that actually you have a relation to it that is different from the relation you have with another thing. So, and what we consider as material at a given moment partly define who we are. One of the reasons angels, saints, and the aura of the saints, etc., were supposed to be material in the Middle Age, as material as other things, is because actually people believed that the primary identity of a human being was to be a believer, was to be a creature of God. One of the reasons today we discover different things is because we are different. So in some ways, materiality is both about what is the physical world out there, how do we experience it, and who are we who experience this physical world. So because materiality is about us, it is deeply political. So it is deeply political because it organizes the way we relate to the physical world and the way we relate to ourselves. So if we go back to the Renaissance, I mentioned that the Renaissance is, of course, linked to a world that is ruled by mathematics. It's a world that can be perceived by a kind of active subject, the subject of humanism, etc. And Renaissance architecture is about all that. And it also has to do with the affirmation of civic values, that the new subject to which architecture is geared towards is actually a subject that sticks to a certain number of values. Let's take a far less pleasant thing, which is the following. Let's take Nazi architecture, Speer's architecture. Speer buildings appear as proposals, actually, regarding the relation between the material world and human subjectivity. They enroll concrete and stone, lark and darkness in a complex game meant to exalt the raw forces of a telluric nature miraculously aligned with cutting-edge militaristic technology. And this is meant to elevate certain subjects, the Führer, the Nazi high dignitaries, etc., while belittling others. So it's, in a way, materiality there is used in a kind of from a kind of totalitarian perspective, which is very different, for example, from what Le Corbusier had in mind, in which he tried, to the contrary, to treat everybody with an equal dignity. For example, at Villa Savoie, the house of the gardener is more modest, for sure, than the villa of the owners, but it is equally refined in terms of architectural vocabulary. So digital architecture today is probably about this changing nature of materiality and what it does mean. So now, architecture, when I say that, can it be political? Can we go as far as to use that to say, for example, that there would be the possibility for architecture to be truly democratic as opposed to the totalitarian examples I just gave? It's actually a little bit complicated, and this is what I'd like to discuss in the final minutes of this presentation. For example, it's clear that if we take the end of the 18th century, architects reinvent or use something that had not been used for a couple of millennia, or at least a millennium and a half, which is the form of the Greco-Roman theater. And they're going to use that form to create the modern assembly room. And in some ways, the modern assembly room for parliaments, etc., this is a project for the French parliament drawn during the French Revolution, is going actually to shape, modern democracy. And, in some ways, many of these assembly rooms based on the Roman theater are still function today. Now, and you could then argue that actually architecture creates situation and decors. For example, it's well known also that the famous expression left and right are in direct relation to who is at the left and the right of the speaker in such a theater. And more generally, architecture has constituted decor for democracies. For example, if you look at the Mall in Washington, it's full of monuments and which create decor for a democracy. But this is actually, when I say it's complicated, it's very striking that the oldest democracy in the world, which is the United Kingdom, never actually switched to the Greco-Roman theater and remained faithful to the model of the medieval parliament, which was, two rows of seats facing each other, and in the center, a throne on which the king or its representative sat as an arbiter of the debates. So all that to say that there is not such a simple relation between architecture and democracy. It is what architecture does is actually to create possibilities, but it's not necessarily to completely determine politically what takes place in it. So in other words, architecture may certainly facilitate the exercise of democracy, but it does not determine its form rigorously. At its most efficient, it orients rather than prescribes. There may be, by the end today, more urgent task for architecture than being democratic. It doesn't mean that architecture should serve totalitarian regime, but there are other ways for architecture to be political today. One example is, for example, sustainability. We all know that the environmental challenge is actually one of the deepest challenge and political issues of our time. And very often, architecture, the idea, sustainable means usually that it's not going to be as fascinating as, the world as we know it. It's going to be degraded, etc. So how to make a sustainable future enticing is a real question today. Is that the answer? The fake promises of artificial greening? Isn't that a better answer? That's to say, to imagine a frugality that is actually magnificent could be probably a question. So we need, in other words, to construct the situation on decor of a world that is changing extremely rapidly under our eyes. What are the architectural situation and decor of an architecture of the age of the Anthropocene? This is, by the way, where the question of utopia might appear. I haven't talked about utopia yet, but utopia as the invention of a different world. So of course, Tafuri in his book, Architecture and Utopia, famously explained that, the relation between architecture and utopia was doomed because, modernism, for example, had failed in delivering its promises. But I'm not sure this is so true. I think actually we probably what Tafuri castigated was the pretension of architecture to be a tool, to be a kind of engineering of the future. And this is what modernity at some point dreamt. What if architecture was actually more about creating possibilities? Again, architecture does not. What architecture does best politically is to suggest possibilities rather than completely encircle and over-determine people. So we should try to imagine an architecture of endless possibilities. This is what situationist artist Constant explored with his new Babylon. What is an architecture of situation and opportunities? An architecture of decor and encounters might be perhaps the political question about architecture today. And with that, I'll stop. Stop share my screen.
Okay, thank you very much, Antoine, for that. Now we can open for questions from the audience. In the meantime, I have some questions myself.
Sure.
I have read a lot of things, but I will start with the last things that you said. I would like if you could elaborate on the relation between materiality, in the sense that you expose it, in the sense that materiality is the relation that we have with matter, in a way, and organization in an abstract way. Because you in the last moment of the presentation you did, you show examples of the parliament, Congress organizations that I don't know in what level that could be engaged in materiality in the way we experience it, because in the organization is already there. I don't know if you can elaborate in the relationship of an abstract organization.
I can try to precise. Actually, what I want to suggest is that, of course, organization is important in architecture. And, this is what I said at the beginning, there is a temptation to reduce the political agency of architecture to organization. For example, Versailles is organized according to royal ritual. So this is political. But what I'm suggesting is that actually it may be superficial, because there is no absolute link between, for example, if you take the form of the parliaments at the end of the 18th century, the British Parliament, which functioned as democratically as the French one or whatever, has not at all the same organization. It actually remains faithful to a non-democratic organization, which was medieval, okay? So in some ways, organization, of course, organization, may have constrained. For example, the panopticon is political, of course but it's relatively rare. I think most of the time, the best way architecture uses its power is actually by suggesting that what we do has a sense. For example, it's very clear, I would say, beyond the organization, the big thing when they reinvent the Greco-Roman theater for an assembly room is to suggest that actually politics is like a theater play. It's a public drama. It's like a theater. And it actually organizes materials, etc., to suggest that this is a stage.
Right.
Which is actually much more powerful. Do I make myself clear?
Maybe with what you said just now, we can think about organization or materiality as an intent, because materials also have an organization in a microscopic level, or even in the way that we put them together, right? You said one passage of the presentation, you said that architecture is about materiality, but also the way that it is organized in a compositional way. So I don't know. I was thinking about that. Maybe the relation it's not always, or not as linear as understood as relation people or the person with the materiality, but there are also relations between matter, right? Where
sure, but don't forget they're also cultural construct in that. That's what I mean, that, you know, what architecture does. To give you another example, you know, materials can change in their nature from one period to another. For example, if you take wood in the 17th century, it's a material that make people immediately think about machines, it's a much more technical material than today, in which we very often accept the new uses of wood in sustainable architecture, but very often wood goes with a certain idea of authenticity, tradition, etc., etc. So architecture, you know, we never relate to the material world in a completely, we always relate to it through the lenses of culture.
Yeah.
The lenses of culture are also about who we are.
Right.
I very often say, for example, you don't understand Versailles if you don't understand that in the 17th century, artificial is exciting.
Yeah.
So if, for example, Louis XIV had known plastics, he would have put plastic all over the Versailles, because the more artificial, the better it was. I think today we're different animals, and we have a different relation to artificiality than, you know, somebody from the 17th century. So I think in some ways, and don't forget that the very notion of material has varied considerably from one period to another. You know, what we call material today, for example, it seems to us perfectly evident that material can be designed at the level of the molecule, which would have been completely unthinkable before. So the very notion of material is changing.
Right. Okay. I'm going to tell the audience if they have any question, you can raise your hand, your virtual hand, or you can place a question in the Q&A button in the bottom place of the screen. I will have one more question,
Sure.
and we can ask the audience to make some. It's regarding this last thing. I really like the last thing that you said, that architecture, I understand it like architecture could generate a new way of approaching politics. I understand that in a way that there's no responsibility in architecture to be democratic, totalitarian, anarchist, or any other position in a political way that we understand, but maybe architecture has the possibility to generate new kinds or new types of politic postures or politic currents. I don't know. So my question would be, what's architectural responsibility in that place? I mean, there's a lot of value in totalitarian architecture as well in democratic architecture, or what we could consider one or the other. And I think that I don't know. I was wondering if you can improvise some type, maybe with examples, some type of architecture politics, you may say, like architecture that you can think of that is proposing a new way of approaching the relation with matter.
Well, for me, for example, the example I gave of the Indian building, in which, you know, you remember the building with a facade,
yeah.
in which you have very low ranking, you know, in a system of Indian caste. You have people who are of very modest origin, who usually are invisible. And because they tend the garden and there is a glass and people in the offices see them, they become visible.
Yeah.
That's for me an example of what architecture can do. Architecture can make visible some people, for example, can remind others that they're citizens. That's for me the best thing architecture can do. You know, and so I would say this is actually political. That's to say, not necessarily an art, and you know, it's not necessarily a huge statement about, you know, equality of condition, etc. But all of a sudden, architecture forces some people to see other people whom they don't see usually.
Right. That even could generate some problems, right? Like
sure,
people that
but
don't want to be seen.
Yes, but I think what architecture does, you know, to give you another example from the past, you know, when the corridor is invented in the 18th century, it completely changes, you know, the relation between humans. And so I think what architecture does, this is what I suggested when I say architecture does actually create situations. It creates two things: situation, that's to say, situation in which, for example, people have to meet or have not to meet. For example, in a 19th century bourgeois apartment, you know, the servants can, you know, do not have the same the same places, etc., than the masters, and etc. So that's a way to separate. Or you can oblige people to meet together. You can do a lot of things like that. You can also let me give you another example of bad architecture. You know, when I was in Munich a long time ago, I was giving a lecture in an institute for history of art in Munich, which is the former siege, the former headquarters of the Nazi party. And it became actually a center for art because right after the end of the war, the Allies put all the art that had been stolen by the Nazi here before resending it to the countries where it had been stolen. But to make a long story short, it was a hyper high-tech building in the 1930s when it was built. But the doors were extremely difficult to open. And I remember I told the German director, you know, why is the door so rusted and why is it so difficult to open? And then the guy explained to me, actually, it was designed by the architects so that people could feel how small they are compared to the party. They were tiny creature compared to the party. To give you another example, if you go to the Stadium of Berlin, and you want to buy, and you know, which was designed also, you know, during the Nazi period, and the ticket booth, you are actually almost, feel like a dwarf. Right. And so architecture, so sadly, there is no democratic architecture, but totalitarian architecture exists.
Right.
Because totalitarian is easier. It's easier to design a prison than a place for democracy. Because a place for democracy, you can just build a place that makes possible democracy. But you can build a prison.
Right. Okay, here we have a question from Melissa. I'm going to allow you to open your microphone, Melissa, so you can ask the question.
Or you can even show your face so that I see who I have the impression to be talking.
My camera is not working. Hello, okay. Antoine.
Hello.
Nice. I have a question. I really like the part in which you say that architecture is not a tool to express or represent a power, but to construct a kind of power. I am thinking in how strong is as a symbol the Palace of Soviets, even though it's not even constructed. So you mentioned Philip Ram in the Chez Deco Park. I was thinking that one can say that that kind of power is a more subtle kind of power. For instance, he's working with humidity, with the temperature of air, texture. My question is, what is the place for that kind of subtle power in the current world? Do you believe that those sensations that are more in the subtle range are stronger now that we have a more distant relation with the physical world, maybe?
I think it's above all that it's a different physical world. I thank you for the question. I think, you know, because of climate change, because we know that, you know, we've entered a dangerous period, etc., we've become ultra sensitive. You know, modernity was aware that there were differences in temperature, etc., etc. But now we're extremely aware that heating is an issue, that etc. So even our perception of what surrounds us is changing. So I think there is a future for these subtle things because they are not that subtle by the end. They're actually massive phenomena. So I think one of the things architecture will have to manage is actually to make sustainability something that is full of promises instead of being a punishment. I think one of the reasons it's so difficult today to do sustainable architecture is because sustainable is still, for many, in the eyes of many people, something that is almost like a punishment. You misbehave, you consume you produce too much CO2, so you will have to live miserably. So I think the real question today about the Anthropocene is how to make the Anthropocene, you know, an adventure that is pleasant. And I think this is why these things do matter today. And in some ways, you know, when some architects like Iñaki Abalos say that we have to pass from mechanics to thermodynamics, which is for me typically a statement about materiality, this is not so subtle. This is the world in which we're going to live in the near future.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Let's see if we have another question. Give some people a moment. I can keep asking things. You know, I think the lecture was amazing. The nice thing that you did, that like you suggest a lot of things, but you talk very little about a lot of things. So it's great because
the purpose was to remain a bit enigmatic for sure, but
yeah.
I agree.
But I don't know, maybe I could ask you something else and give.
Oh, there is a question.
Yes, here we have a question from Federico.
And we have another one. Okay, yeah. Good. So Federico, can you all see the questions?
No, only you and me. So maybe.
Okay. So Federico, yes, sure. Thanks for the interesting take on materiality. From the outside, it seemed that certain topics in architecture are not only politicized, but partisan. For example, green architecture seems to be taken by progressive public, while conservative parties have claimed the classical reference in language. Do you see any possibilities in escaping this situation? I do see not only a possibility, but a necessity. Because I do think that green architecture, just pasting tree on a facade, is actually a very superficial answer to the problems. It's transforming the trees into some kind of ornament. So, and you know, classical reference today are, you know, partly meaningless, past, you know, the impression of déjà vu, etc. So we do have to escape that. And I think, for example, green architecture does not mean that you're going to cut and paste trees on every balcony. It means something else. It means, as I said, for example, that it's going to be an architecture that is more subtle in playing with you know, elements of the climate, etc., of light, etc. So we need, yes, to escape that. I think when architecture is too much transformed into a static image, it's no longer architecture, it's a caricature of architecture in some ways.
That has something to do with how we measure these kind of things. I mean, how we measure, if it's possible to measure sensation in a way to escape just the discourse.
Well, it's about going back. You know, at the beginning I said, you know, one of the things architecture does, for example, extremely well, is to complicate the relation between inside and outside. You know, if you take, you know, since we're in Argentina tonight, take Casa Curuchet. Casa Curuchet is a house in which you're outside, then you enter. Once you've entered, you're actually in an inside, which is an outside, because you're, you know, there is the tree, etc. And then to get inside the house, you have to go to a box, and then, and you realize that actually the whole house makes you wonder what is inside versus what is outside. What does it mean to live versus what does it mean to be in the city, etc. And then you realize this is full of potential to rethink the relation between living and being in a city, etc. So that's what architecture does best, if you want. Or to give you another analogy, and then I'll go to Maria Laura question. You remember Romulus and Remus? And Romulus draws a line and says, inside the line, this is going to be a city. Right. I think this is a little bit what architecture does. It draws a line, and inside the line, this is where human action matters. And then humans, it doesn't tell exactly what humans should do, but it tells them that here, whatever they do, it's meaningful. So that's, I think, what architecture does best. So Maria Laura Alvarez, character was a central element in classical architecture and in the formation of nation states, especially in French architecture in the 17th to 19th century. How do you consider the impact of the emergence of the avant-garde and the loss of classical elements, especially in the architecture of the 30s of the 20th century, and the need to represent certain state of architecture, certain state architecture? Oof, it's a difficult question. You're talking, well, and then Maria, I'm talking about monumentality. I'll be honest, and you know, I am chairman of the Fondation de Corbusier, so God knows I have nothing against modernity. But I think one of the big problems of modernity was precisely monumentality, which is why, by the way, it tried to address it when at the time of brutalism, etc. Why it was a problem? Because monument means a relation to memory. You know, a monument etymologically is something that makes you remember. And I think modernity had actually this very complex relation with the question of memory, because it tried to distantiate itself from the 19th century. 19th century architecture is all about the relation to history, memory, etc. It's obsessed by that to a point that becomes problematic. So early 20th century tries to get rid of history and memory, etc. And then it has a problem with the monument because of that. So, so this is the loss of the classical element is actually part of a broader problem, which is, in my opinion, that the question of history and memory is becomes, a kind of a structural problem, shortcoming of modernity, which is why, by the way, post-war modernity will try to address it. You take Le Corbusier, the purist villa, usually don't raise that question. After the war, the relation to history and memory come back in Le Corbusier extremely strongly, to the point, by the way, that Le Corbusier in his last books talks about ornament, strangely.
Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, maybe I can ask you one more thing. That, in fact, it's a question that I wanted to ask you after reading your book on ornament. That has to do with how we relate with not only with ornament but with materiality today. That is, if you can elaborate on the relation between, it has to do with my first question, in fact, but if you could elaborate on the way that we relate ornament with organization, in the way that you, I think that you address in your book that ornament is more and more relating with the structure of buildings in a way that it's not the the structure that makes the building stand up, but the structure that organizes, like the virtual structure, in a way. So is there the possibility to understand, to make a shift towards ornament as structure in architecture? Also thinking about this new AI venture that some architects are going into today, and positioning organization in a more unstable place, right? Where the things tend to produce sensation first and organization after. I don't know if I am totally making sense with the question.
You are making sense, but it's an extremely complex question. I'm not sure I can fully answer it. I think for me, one of the reasons I got interested in that is because there is a huge amount of unclarity about the political question today. And I think especially in the digital, I think the digital architecture has had a great incapacity to address really political questions. And that's for me a real problem. And it should be able, and what I'm suggesting is actually to start from materiality if we want to address it. Because starting from materiality would be actually to start from this naive question, but which I think designers sometimes tend to forget, which is, for whom do we build? When I say materiality is about our relation to the material world, but ultimately it's about who are we. I think, digital architecture has played with a lot of fantasy figures, cyborgs, distributed subjectivity, etc. But actually they're floating out there without real social substance. So I think we need, we need really to try to address that. And for me, that's one of the biggest problem of ornament these days. It's not that it relates or not relate to organization, is that it's only about affect and it has no clear social significance, which is for me a real problem, because ornament used to be a social sign, which still exists. For example, take fashion, take etc. The type of clothes, the type of watch you wear, the type of jewel, these are ornaments of the body, and they're very clearly socially connotated. How is it that architecture tries to be completely neutral, as if buildings had no social identity, that etc. So I do think there is a problem there, to be honest, and it goes beyond. So I think it's not necessarily organization the problem. I think it's a lack of clarity about where things stand socially.
Right.
Does it make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah.
To take an example, also let's take a Latin America Pritzker Prize, Aravena. Aravena is a talented designer, but he's doing as if there was no social hierarchy, that the poor people for whom he's designing sometimes are exactly the same as the people from the Catholic University of Chile who come from the bourgeoisie, and as if it was the same crowd. So there is as if architecture could address everything being neutral in some ways. And I think this is where actually organization is not enough, because organization, you could say, yes, the organization of the business school, he designed, the building of the business school of the Catholic University, so quite nice building. So this is different from social housing for very poor people. So the organization is different, but it's as if the architecture was neutral. It was just serving organization. Architecture does more. It is supposed to express what the organization is about socially.
That's great. Well, I think with that we reach the end of this event. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you for having me, and have a good evening in Buenos Aires. As for me, I'm going to go to bed. So,
thank you very much, and thank you for staying
in Europe.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, Antoine.
Take care. Bye.
And thank you for the attendees. See you on Thursday for the last day of this symposium and the workshop of Federico Menichetti on AI and ornament. So thank you very much, and see you on Thursday.